It was a quiet morning in a suburban neighborhood, the kind of peaceful start to a day that many people take for granted. The sun had barely begun to rise, casting a soft light over the trees, and birds chirped in the distance. For most people, it was just another day, another routine. But for one man, it was the beginning of something that would shatter his life and the quiet peace he had worked so hard to find. He had long since put his past behind him, choosing to live away from the chaos of the world he once knew. His life had been full of danger, uncertainty, and secrecy, but now he sought peace. His small home was tucked away at the end of a quiet street, far from the noise and bustle of the city. The man had a simple life now, spent walking his dog, taking long drives through the countryside, and enjoying the few remaining years of tranquility that were his after a long career in the military. The dog was his closest companion. It wasn't just any dog. It was his friend, his ally through the darkest times. Years ago, this dog had been there with him during his toughest moments, and together, they had experienced things that no one could ever understand. The man had never fully trusted anyone, but the dog was different. Loyal, strong, and understanding, the dog was his constant companion through thick and thin. On this particular morning, the man and his dog walked together through the neighborhood. The streets were still, the houses empty, as most of the neighbors were either asleep or getting ready for their day. The dog, a medium-sized black Labrador, was content by his side, its tail wagging slowly as they walked. The man enjoyed these moments. The feeling of the cool morning air, the peace that came with the dog's presence, and the sense of normalcy. He had been through so much, had seen things no one should have to see, but in these moments, he was just another person. No one special, just a man and his dog.
He had wanted this.
A life of quiet, of safety, away from the world he once knew. But fate had other plans. As the man and his dog made their way down the street, they were unaware of the two police officers driving slowly through the neighborhood. The officers had been dispatched for a routine call, a report of a suspicious person in the area. It was a typical early morning check. There was nothing extraordinary about it. The officers had no idea who lived on the street or what they might encounter. When the police car passed the man and his dog, the officers saw the dog first. It wasn't unusual for people to walk their dogs early in the morning, but this dog was different. It was large, muscular, and seemed to be standing watch, its eyes alert as it looked at the approaching officers. The man, sensing the tension, instinctively took a few steps toward the dog, trying to calm it. But the dog, protective by nature, did not lower its stance. It growled lowly, sensing something unfamiliar. From the officer's perspective, the dog's stance seemed threatening. They hadn't seen the dog before and assumed it might be a danger. In their minds, the situation was clear. A large dog growling, approaching two police officers, it had to be a threat. One officer, acting on instinct, reached for his firearm. Without any further warning, he aimed and fired. The shot rang out across the quiet street, echoing in the stillness. The dog yelped and collapsed, the bullet striking it in an instant. The man stood frozen in disbelief, his heart racing. He rushed toward his dog, but it was too late. The animal was already lifeless, its body limp and cold in the man's arms. The officers, still in shock, stood by the car. They hadn't meant to kill the dog, but the adrenaline and fear had clouded their judgment. They hadn't known who the man was or the history he carried with him. They hadn't known that the man was someone who had once been part of the most elite special forces unit in the world, the Delta Force. They had no idea that the man they had just wronged had seen and done things most people could never comprehend. They had no idea of the level of discipline and responsibility that ran through his veins. The man's mind raced as he held his dog's lifeless body. The peaceful life he had built in the years since leaving the military felt like it was being torn apart in an instant. He had tried so hard to escape his past, to live a life that was as far removed from the violence he once knew as possible. But now in this moment it was all rushing back. The anger, the hurt, the feeling of helplessness, it all surged within him. The officers approached cautiously, now realizing the gravity of their mistake. One of them, still holding his firearm, tried to apologize, but the words were hollow. The man didn't hear them. His world had shifted. The death of his dog was not just a loss of a pet. It was a violation of everything he had tried to rebuild. It was a reminder of the world he had left behind, the world that would always be a part of him no matter how far he ran from it. The officers, still unaware of who the man was, apologized repeatedly, but the words meant nothing. The man could barely speak. His mind was too clouded by grief and rage. In his arms, the dog's once warm body was now cold and still, a symbol of the life he had lost. It wasn't just the loss of the dog that tore at him, it was the injustice of it all. The police had acted on fear and assumptions without knowing the full story. They had taken away his companion, his friend, without any understanding of the person they had targeted. The man's mind began to race, not just with anger at what had happened, but with questions. Why had they acted so quickly? Why had they not taken the time to assess the situation before pulling the trigger? The officers stood there helpless, unsure of how to fix the damage they had caused. They didn't know who they were dealing with. They didn't know that the man standing before them had been trained to handle situations far more dangerous than this. They didn't know that the man was capable of ending their lives in an instant if he had wanted to. But instead he stood there, his face a mask of grief, his hand clutching the dog's lifeless body. In the coming days, the incident would spark outrage, but the officers still had no idea who the man truly was. To them, he was just another resident, just another person who had lost a pet. But for the man, the loss went deeper than the death of a dog. It was the loss of his peace, the loss of the quiet life he had fought so hard to find. The streets may have returned to their normal quietness, but for the man, the world had changed forever. The man sat quietly in the days following the incident, lost in a sea of thoughts that seemed to churn and twist in his mind. The pain of losing his dog was deeper than he had expected. He had always known that his connection with the animal was strong, but in that moment he realized just how much the dog had meant to him. It wasn't just a pet, it was a part of him, a companion through years of pain, sacrifice, and uncertainty. Every day the man had walked with his dog, finding comfort in the simple act of companionship. They had shared moments of silence, moments of joy, and moments of reflection. In many ways, the dog had been the one constant in his life, the one thing that had never turned its back on him. And now it was gone, taken from him in an instant by an act of fear and misunderstanding. In the days after the shooting, the neighborhood felt different. The quiet streets now seemed unsettlingly empty, and the world outside his door felt colder. The man went about his daily routine, but his heart wasn't in it. He couldn't shake the image of his dog lying lifeless on the street. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw that moment, the sound of the gunshot, the look of confusion and fear in the dog's eyes. It haunted him. The police officers had come to apologize, but their words felt like nothing more than an empty gesture. They hadn't understood the gravity of what they had done. To them, it had been a simple mistake, a misunderstanding. But to the man, it was more than that. It was a reminder of everything he had tried to leave behind, everything he had fought to escape. For years, the man had been part of a world that required him to be constantly on guard. He had been trained to handle high-stakes situations, to make split-second decisions that could mean the difference between life and death. But in this world, in this quiet suburban neighborhood, he had hoped to find something different: peace, normalcy, a chance to live without fear, without the weight of his past hanging over him. But now, the peace he had worked so hard to create felt like an illusion. It had been shattered in an instant by a mistake made out of fear. And as the days passed, the anger that had been simmering inside him began to bubble to the surface. He couldn't let this go. He couldn't let the officers walk away from this believing that what they had done was justified. They needed to understand that there was more to the story than they had seen. The man's mind drifted back to his time in the military. Back then, there was always a clear sense of purpose. There was a mission, a goal, a reason to fight. His life had been about protecting others, about serving a cause greater than himself. But now, here he was, in a world that had no understanding of the sacrifices he had made, a world that had no idea what he had seen, what he had done. He felt as though his past had been forgotten, dismissed, and it angered him. But more than the anger, there was the sadness. He missed the quiet moments with his dog, the way the dog would nudge his hand when it wanted attention, the way it would sit by his side when he was lost in thought. The dog had been his partner in ways that no human could ever be. And now it was gone. The man found himself questioning everything. Had he really escaped his past, or had his past simply found a way to catch up with him? He began to feel the weight of the world again, the burden of a life that had never really let him go. He had always believed that leaving the military behind would allow him to start fresh. But in this small town, this quiet neighborhood, the shooting of his dog felt like the world had found a way to remind him of who he once was. And in doing so, it had taken something precious from him. One evening, after another long day of walking through the motions, the man sat on his porch, staring at the empty space where his dog used to sit. The chair beside him was empty, but he still felt the weight of the dog's presence. It was strange how something so simple could leave such a big hole. The man had always prided himself on being able to keep his emotions in check, to remain calm and composed even in the most intense situations. But now, in the quiet of his own home, he felt vulnerable, exposed. The doorbell rang, interrupting his thoughts. It was the officers again. They had come to check on him, to see how he was doing. The man stood up slowly, his eyes cold. He didn't want to deal with them, but he knew he couldn't avoid this conversation forever. He opened the door and the officers stood there looking uncomfortable. They weren't sure what to say. The words they had used the last time they spoke had felt hollow, like they were trying to fill a gap that couldn't be filled. "We just wanted to see how you're doing," one of the officers said, his voice hesitant. "We're really sorry about what happened. It wasn't supposed to go down like that." The man didn't say anything at first. He just stood there, staring at them. His anger was still there, but now it was more controlled, more deliberate. "You're sorry," he said, his voice low. "But that doesn't bring him back, does it?" The officers looked at each other, unsure of how to respond. They had no idea what to say. They couldn't fix what had happened. They couldn't undo the damage they had caused. But they had come to offer their apologies, to try to make things right. The man wasn't interested in their apologies. He didn't need them. "I don't want your apologies," he said, his voice sharp. "I want you to understand what you've done. You took something from me. And you didn't even realize who you were dealing with." The officers looked confused. "What do you mean by that?" one of them asked. The man's gaze hardened, and for a moment the past seemed to swallow him whole. He had spent so many years keeping his identity hidden, keeping the world at arm's length, but now, standing before these officers, he knew it was time to let them see who he really was. "I used to be someone who served this country," he said, his voice quiet but intense. "I was a part of Delta Force. I did things you couldn't imagine. I've seen the darkest parts of the world. And this," he gestured to the empty chair, "this dog was my only peace, my only family." The officers stood there stunned. They had no idea who they were talking to. They had no idea that the man before them wasn't just an ordinary resident of the neighborhood. They hadn't known that he was a highly trained soldier, someone who had seen and done things that most people would never understand. "I've been trained to handle life and death situations," the man continued, his voice steady. "But I'm not that person anymore. I'm not the man I used to be. I just wanted to live in peace. And now you've taken that peace from me." The officers stood in silence, not sure how to respond. They had never expected this. They had no idea that the man they had encountered was someone who had served in the most elite forces in the world. They hadn't known that the dog they had shot was more than just a pet. It was a lifeline. The man turned away from them, his back stiff. "You'll never understand what you've done," he said quietly. "But maybe, just maybe, you'll learn from this. Maybe you'll think twice next time before pulling that trigger." He closed the door without waiting for a response, leaving the officers standing there, their words hanging in the air. The man stood by the door, his hand resting on the doorknob, his mind racing. The conversation had been a turning point. He wasn't going to let this go. Not now, not ever. Days passed, and with each one the man's sense of loss deepened. The shooting of his dog had left a mark that couldn't be erased, and though he had tried to move on, the weight of what had happened felt like a shadow hanging over him. The quiet suburban life he had worked so hard to build now felt foreign to him. Every time he stepped outside, every time he passed the spot where his dog had fallen, the pain resurfaced. It wasn't just the loss of his dog that hurt. It was the feeling of helplessness. The feeling that no one understood the depth of what he had lost. He had tried to find peace in this small town, far away from the violence and chaos of his past. But now, it seemed like the past had found him once again in the form of a single tragic mistake. The man had spent years pushing aside the horrors of his previous life, trying to escape the memories and the weight of the decisions he had made. But now it was all coming back to him, and he wasn't sure how to handle it. The neighborhood, which had once felt like a safe haven, now felt like a cage. The people who lived here, The ones who went about their daily routines without a care in the world, couldn't possibly understand what he had gone through. They didn't know about the missions, the danger, the sacrifices. They didn't know about the things he had seen in far-off lands, the lives he had saved and the lives he had taken. To them, he was just another resident, just another man with a dog. But for him, the dog had been a link to something more, something that had kept him grounded in a world that often felt out of control. In the days after the shooting, the officers had come by once more, but this time, the man wasn't interested in speaking with them. He had made his point, and there was nothing more to say. The pain was still raw, still fresh, and the words they had offered seemed empty. The apologies had done nothing to bring back his dog. They hadn't fixed anything. They hadn't even begun to understand what had happened. The man found himself slipping into old habits, spending long hours at home, trying to bury the anger and frustration that had taken root inside him. He had always been able to compartmentalize his feelings, to push them aside and keep moving forward. But now it felt like there was no way to escape the emotions swirling inside him. It wasn't just the anger at the officers. It was the anger at himself for not seeing this coming. He had tried so hard to distance himself from the past, but in the end, the past had caught up with him in the most painful way possible. As the days wore on, the man started to notice something odd. The neighbors, once friendly and welcoming, began to act differently around him. Some avoided making eye contact while others offered forced smiles. It was as if the entire neighborhood had somehow been affected by the incident, as though his own pain had spilled out and touched everyone around him. It was strange. He had always been a private person, keeping to himself, but now it felt like he was being watched, judged. It made him uncomfortable, like he was being scrutinized in a way he couldn't control. He had never been one to care about what others thought of him. He had lived his life on his terms, and that had always been enough. But now the isolation he had once found comfort in felt suffocating. He couldn't walk down the street without feeling like the eyes of the neighborhood were on him. It was as though the loss of his dog had become a public affair, a tragedy that everyone had witnessed but no one could truly understand. One evening, as the man sat in his living room, the sound of a knock at the door broke the silence. He wasn't expecting anyone. He stood up slowly, his heart rate quickening as he approached the door. He had no idea who it could be. When he opened it, he found a figure standing there, someone he hadn't expected to see, a local journalist, someone who had heard about the incident and wanted to speak with him. "I'm sorry to bother you," the journalist began, "but I've been following the story and I wanted to hear your side. People are talking about what happened, and I think it's important to get the full picture." The man stood in the doorway for a moment, considering the request. He hadn't planned on speaking to anyone about what had happened, not to the press, not to anyone. But there was something in the journalist's eyes, an honesty, a genuine desire to understand that made him hesitate. "Why would you want to hear my side?" the man asked, his voice gruff. "There's nothing to say. It was a mistake and my dog is dead." The journalist nodded, understanding. "I know. But I think there's more to it than just that. This isn't just about a dog. This is about something bigger. It's about the choices people make, the consequences, and how we all handle the things we've done." The man paused. He had never been one to share his story. He had always kept it buried deep inside, locked away in a part of himself that no one could access. But something about the journalist's words struck a chord with him. Maybe it was the way she spoke. Or maybe it was the way she seemed to understand that there was more to the story than just what had happened on the street that day. "I don't want to talk about it," the man said, his voice quieter now. "There's nothing anyone can do to change what happened." The journalist didn't push him. She simply nodded and said, "I understand, but I think at some point you'll want to tell your story. It's not just about what happened to your dog. It's about you, about who you are." The man stood there for a moment, the weight of her words sinking in. He wasn't sure if he was ready to share his past or if he ever would be. But there was a part of him that knew deep down that the pain of what had happened wasn't just about the dog. It was about everything that had led him to this point, everything he had tried to leave behind. And maybe, just maybe, telling his story would be the first step toward healing. He closed the door, the journalist's words still echoing in his mind. He didn't know if he was ready to face his past, but he knew one thing for sure. He couldn't keep running from it. He had spent too many years trying to escape, too many years hiding from the person he used to be. Maybe now was the time to stop hiding and face the truth. As he sat back down in his living room, the man thought about the life he had led before the quiet suburban streets, before the dog, before the pain. He thought about the missions, the people he had met, the things he had done. He thought about the fear, the adrenaline, the feeling of being part of something larger than himself. And in that moment, he realized that the past would never truly let him go. But maybe, just maybe, he could find a way to live with it, to make peace with it. For the first time since the shooting, the man felt a flicker of hope. Maybe there was a way forward, a way to heal the wounds that had been left open for so long. Maybe it was time to stop running. The days seemed to stretch on endlessly, each one feeling heavier than the last. The weight of what had happened, the death of his dog, and the unspoken tension that had settled over his life, lingered in the man's mind. The peaceful life he had tried so hard to build seemed like a distant memory now. It wasn't just the loss of the dog that hurt. It was the feeling that everything he had worked for, everything he had hoped to find in this quiet town, had been shattered. And the more he thought about it, the more he realized that it wasn't just the dog that had been taken from him. It was a piece of his own humanity, a part of himself that he wasn't sure he could ever get back. The world outside his door had changed too. The officers, the ones who had come to apologize, still seemed to be watching him from a distance. There was an awkwardness in the air, something unsaid between them, as though everyone knew the incident had been more than just a simple mistake. The neighbors, who had once greeted him with friendly nods, now looked away when he passed by. It was as if they knew something had happened, but no one dared to speak about it. It made the man feel more isolated than ever. There was a part of him that wanted to reach out, to talk to someone, to explain everything. But he didn't know where to start. He had spent so many years hiding from the truth, burying his past so deep that even he wasn't sure what lay beneath the surface anymore. And now with the dog gone, it felt like that past was catching up to him in ways he hadn't anticipated. The quiet life he had once dreamed of felt like an illusion, something he could never really have. One evening, as the man sat on his porch, lost in his thoughts, he noticed a car slowly driving down the street. The headlights were bright in the dark, but the car seemed to be moving in an unusual way. It stopped in front of his house, and for a moment the man thought about getting up and going inside. But something made him pause. He didn't know why, but he had a feeling that this was something he couldn't ignore. The car remained parked for a few moments, the engine running. The man stood up and walked slowly toward it, his footsteps deliberate and steady. When he reached the car, the window rolled down, and he saw the face of the journalist who had visited him a few days earlier. "I know it's late," she said, her voice soft, "but I think we need to talk." The man didn't say anything at first. He simply looked at her, his face expressionless. The journalist had been persistent, and though he had been reluctant to speak with her, he had to admit that she seemed genuinely interested in understanding what had happened. It wasn't about the dog anymore. It was about something much deeper. About him. About the past he had tried to leave behind. "I don't know what you want from me," the man finally said, his voice low. "I want to understand," she replied. "I want to understand what happened that day, why it happened, and why it matters. People are talking, but they don't know the full story. They don't know who you are." The man stared at her for a long time, the weight of her words sinking in. He hadn't planned on talking to anyone about his past, but the more he thought about it, the more he realized that this was something he couldn't keep bottled up forever. The dog's death had been the tipping point, but it had also forced him to confront the man he had once been. The man who had spent years in the shadows, doing things that no one could ever know about. "All right," he said finally, his voice steady. "I'll tell you, but it's not going to be what you expect." The journalist nodded, and the man got into the car. As they drove, he felt the weight of the conversation ahead of him. He wasn't sure if he was ready to face his past, but there was something about the journalist that made him feel like maybe, just maybe, it was time to stop hiding. "I don't know where to start," he said, his voice quiet. "I guess I've been running from this for a long time. I joined the military when I was young. I was just a kid, really, but I wanted to do something that mattered, something bigger than myself. So I went through the training, I became part of Delta Force. It wasn't easy, but I was good at it. I had to be. I was always the one they called when things went wrong, when there was no one else. It was hard, but it was what I was meant to do." The journalist listened, her face serious as she absorbed his words. "I was part of missions that no one will ever know about," he continued, his voice tinged with a quiet bitterness. "I did things that haunt me to this day. But there was no room for emotion. It wasn't about who I was, it was about getting the job done, saving lives. But the more I did it, the more I realized that it wasn't just about the missions. It was about survival. And when you're in that world, you lose sight of everything else. The lines blur. The things you do, the things you're asked to do, they change you. They make you someone else." He paused for a moment, his eyes distant. "I left that life because I couldn't keep doing it anymore. I couldn't keep pretending that it was okay. I came here to this town to try to forget it all, to start fresh. But no matter how far I ran, I couldn't escape what I'd done. The past always finds a way to catch up with you." The journalist didn't interrupt, allowing him to speak. She could see the pain in his eyes, the weight of his words. She knew that this wasn't just a story. It was a man's life, a life that had been shaped by the things he had done, the things he had been forced to do. "After everything," the man continued, his voice breaking slightly, "I thought I could find peace. I thought that if I just stayed quiet, if I kept my head down, I could be like everyone else. But I couldn't. And when they shot my dog, it felt like everything I had worked for, everything I had hoped for was gone. It wasn't just about the dog. It was about the life I had tried to build, the peace I had wanted. They took that from me." The journalist sat silently, processing his words. It was clear that the man had been carrying this burden for a long time. And though he hadn't asked for anyone's sympathy, it was impossible not to feel for him. "I'm sorry," she said softly. "I didn't know. I didn't realize what you had been through." The man shook his head, his jaw tightening. "No one does. And I don't expect them to. I've kept it all buried because that's the way it had to be. But now it feels like it's all coming back, and I don't know what to do with it." They drove in silence for a while, the weight of the conversation lingering between them. Finally, the man spoke again, his voice quieter now. "I don't know what happens next. I don't know how to fix this. But I know one thing. I'm not going to let what happened to my dog be forgotten. I'm going to make sure people understand that there's more to this story, more than just a man and his dog. This is about justice. This is about making sure that what happened doesn't happen again." The journalist nodded, understanding the gravity of his words. "I'll help you," she said quietly. "I'll tell your story." And in that moment, the man realized that he wasn't alone anymore. The weight of his past, the grief from the loss, it was all still there. But maybe, just maybe, sharing it with someone else, letting the world understand what had really happened, could be the first step toward healing. The weeks that followed the conversation with the journalist felt like a blur. The man had given her his story, told her the things he had kept hidden for so long. The weight of it all still hung heavy on his shoulders, but for the first time in a long time, he didn't feel like he was carrying it alone. The journalist had kept her word, and soon, the story of what had happened, of the loss of his dog and of the man he used to be, began to spread. The neighborhood, once quiet and distant, was now talking. People who had avoided him now looked at him with a mix of curiosity and sympathy. Some of them had read the article. Some had heard about it through word of mouth. The man didn't know how he felt about the attention. On one hand, he hated it. He never wanted to be the center of attention. He never wanted anyone to know what he had been through. But on the other hand, the article had started a conversation, one that needed to be had. It wasn't just about a dog. It was about accountability, about understanding the consequences of actions, about the things people do without thinking. The officers who had been involved in the shooting hadn't come back to speak with him. He didn't expect them to. He knew that they had already said what they needed to say, and their actions had already shown what they thought about the incident. The man had no illusions about what they believed. Whether they acknowledged it or not, they had made a mistake, and it had cost him something precious. They would never understand the full weight of that. But now the man was determined to make sure that the story didn't fade away. The dog's death had been tragic, yes, but it had also been a turning point for him. It was the catalyst for facing the things he had buried deep inside himself. He had spent so long trying to forget his past, trying to outrun the man he used to be, but now he knew that he couldn't keep running. His past was part of him, and no matter how much he wished it wasn't, it was something he had to come to terms with. The days grew warmer as the months passed, and the man started to spend more time outside, though it still wasn't easy. He couldn't walk down the street without thinking about the dog. He couldn't look at the places they used to visit without feeling a pang of loss. But he also began to understand that the dog had been more than just a companion. It had been his anchor. The dog had been the one constant in his life, the one thing that had kept him grounded when everything else felt out of control. The dog had been the bridge between the man he used to be and the man he was trying to become. One afternoon, the man went to the spot where the shooting had happened, the place where his dog had fallen, lifeless and still, in the street. He stood there for a long time, his thoughts a mixture of sadness, anger, and regret. But as he stood there, something shifted inside him. The anger that had been consuming him began to ease, replaced by something else, something like acceptance. He knew that nothing could bring the dog back. No amount of anger or frustration would change the past. The only thing he could do now was to honor the dog's memory. He left the spot quietly, walking with a new sense of purpose. It wasn't about getting justice anymore. It wasn't about making the officers pay for their mistake. It was about moving forward. It was about finding peace in the midst of everything that had happened. He wasn't sure how that peace would come or when, but for the first time, he felt like he was on the path to finding it. The next few weeks brought more reflection. The article had sparked conversations, some of which the man found difficult. Some people offered their condolences, others offered their opinions, and some even seemed to judge him, though he could never tell exactly why. He wasn't sure if they felt sorry for him, or if they saw him as someone who had been wronged. Either way, it didn't matter. What mattered now was that he was no longer hiding from who he was. He wasn't hiding from his past or the things he had done. He was learning to live with it. He didn't know what the future would hold. Maybe he would find peace here in this quiet town. Maybe he would finally be able to leave the past behind. Or maybe the past would always be a part of him, a part he couldn't fully escape. But he had made peace with that idea. He had made peace with himself. One day, as he was walking down the street, a woman stopped him. She was a neighbor, someone he had seen around but never really spoken to. She had a gentle smile on her face as she approached him. "I just wanted to say I'm sorry for your loss," she said softly. "I read the article and I can't imagine what you've been through." The man nodded, unsure of what to say. He wasn't used to receiving this kind of sympathy, but there was something different about the way she spoke. It wasn't pity. It wasn't judgment. It was just a simple human gesture of kindness, and for a moment he felt something shift inside him. "Thank you," he said quietly. "I'm trying to move forward. It's not easy, but I'm getting there." She nodded, offering him a warm smile. "I hope you do. I think you will." As the conversation ended and the woman walked away, the man stood still for a moment, reflecting on what she had said. It wasn't just about moving forward, was it? It was about finding a way to keep living despite the pain. It was about finding a way to live with the things that had happened, to make peace with them and to keep going. He knew that the pain would always be there, lurking in the background. The memory of his dog, the regret of what had happened, the questions about the past, all of it would always be with him. But he also knew that he didn't have to let it control him. He didn't have to let it define him. In the days that followed, the man began to spend more time with the few neighbors who still reached out to him. He started to reconnect with the world, slowly but surely. He didn't know where it would lead, but for the first time in a long time, he wasn't afraid of what was ahead. He wasn't afraid of the past anymore either. He had faced it, shared it, and now he could live with it. The man didn't know if he would ever fully heal from the loss. He didn't know if he would ever forget the pain of that day. But he had come to realize something important, that life, no matter how broken it might seem, still goes on. It was up to him to keep moving, to keep going, even when everything around him seemed uncertain. And as he walked down the quiet street that had once felt so foreign to him, he finally felt a sense of peace. He had lived through the worst of it, and he was still here. He wasn't defined by the past, and he didn't need to be defined by the loss. He was just a man walking forward, taking each step as it came. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough.